Hello, anatomy students. In this lecture video, we are going to talk about the brainstem and the cerebellum. The brainstem is largely a relay station. It's going to connect the brain to the spinal cord, and it's going to run from the thalamus, which is this area on our picture here, from the thalamus all the way down to the spinal cord. It's composed of three parts, which include the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata, which you see here colored in this picture. The brainstem is largely the life center. It's going to control such activities as breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. Let's first talk about the midbrain. It's a very small part of the brainstem, as you can see in this picture. On the anterior side, you have an area called the cerebral peduncles. And in the back, you have what's called the corpora quadrigemina, which are just some swellings, which we'll talk about on the next slide. In between those, you have the cerebral aqueduct, which is a canal filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And the cerebral aqueduct will connect the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle. As I mentioned, the posterior aspect of the midbrain has four swellings, which collectively are called the corpora quadrigemina, or the bodies of four twins. And that's because you have two swellings that look similar on top or on the superior aspect, and then you have two that are similar on the inferior aspect. And these first two, which are considered the superior colliculi, these two are involved in vision, and these are going to help us with our eye movement, like with tracking moving objects, and it's also going to sense visual stimuli from the eyes. The inferior colliculi are involved in the conduction of impulses from our hearing centers. So the superior colliculi, vision, and the inferior colliculi, hearing. The cerebral peduncles are found on the anterior aspect, and these are going to convey largely motor impulses from the cerebrum to the spinal cord. The midbrain also contains some of the projection fibers that we talked about when we were talking about the cerebrum. And these are the tracts that are going to convey motor information from the cerebral cortex down through the brainstem and then out to the spinal cord. The midbrain also has some specialized nuclei. Recall that nuclei in the central nervous system are clusters of nerve cell bodies that appear gray in color. These are called the substantia nigra. They contain dopamine-producing cells. And when these cells are damaged or if they start to die, the level of dopamine drops in the brain. And the patient is not able to temper their muscle movements. Recall that one of the functions of dopamine is to antagonize acetylcholine, which is necessary for muscle contraction. And in antagonizing acetylcholine, our muscle movements are going to be nice and smooth and continuous. If they're not, if there's a decrease in the levels of dopamine, that is indicative of Parkinson's disease or PD. The pons is the next area of the brainstem that I wanted to talk about. And the pons is simply a bulge that is located below the midbrain and above the medulla oblongata. It's the middle portion of the brainstem. It's the conduction pathway from the body up to the thalamus, the cerebrum, and it's also going to connect to the cerebellum. And the pons is involved in regulating respiratory movements, like the speed of your inhalation and your exhalation. Finally, we have the medulla oblongata. This is the most inferior portion of the brainstem. It's going to control cardiac function, respiratory function, but it's different from the pons. Remember, the pons is going to control the speed of inhalation and exhalation, whereas the medulla oblongata is responsible for other aspects of breathing, like force and rhythm that is involved in inhaling and exhaling. It's also going to help to control blood pressure in its vasomotor sensors. So it's going to cause blood vessels to dilate and to constrict, again, depending on what the body needs at the time. The medulla oblongata also contains fiber tracts. This is also the place where the projection fibers cross over or decussate. So the projection fibers or the motor tracts that begin in the cerebrum on the left are going to cross in the medulla oblongata, and they're going to move on to the right side of the spinal cord. And the same is true for the projection fibers that begin on the right side of the cerebrum. They're going to start on the right, travel down the brainstem, and in the medulla oblongata, they cross over so that they enter the left side of the spinal cord. The fourth ventricle is located in between the medulla oblongata and the cerebellum. The picture that I have here on the slide is of a sheep brain, and this is a mid-sagittal section, so we've cut through the corpus callosum, and so we're looking at the inside of the brain here. You can see that the cerebellum is labeled, and here is the medulla oblongata, and there's a very small space right here. I'm just going to draw a red line. That is the fourth ventricle that is filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And then the fourth ventricle is continuous with the central canal, with the central canal of the spinal cord, which is here. And so the cerebral spinal fluid that is circulating through the ventricles is also going to circulate through the center of the spinal cord as well. The last portion that I wanted to talk about once again, because we did talk about this when we talked about the cerebrum, is the reticular activating system, or the RAS. The RAS is a diffuse network of neurons that is largely responsible for consciousness. It's also going to be a filter for sensory information. So it's going to kind of filter out or allow you to ignore weak signals or repetitive signals, and it's going to ensure that only the really important stimuli make it up to the cortex of the brain. And I wanted to mention it here also because it is located in the brainstem, as you can see here in the picture. But then, I also wanted you to see too that it's going to receive input from the ears as well as from the eyes. So it's going to kind of process a lot of different sources of sensory information. So this is another mid-sagittal section of the brain. This, however, is a human brain. And I can tell just from the angle of the spinal cord and the brainstem. In the sheep brain, it was more horizontal with the floor, whereas here it's in a human, it's situated in a more perpendicular fashion. And so here you can see that we have, you can see where the hypothalamus is, right over here. But more importantly, just to review our brainstem, we have the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And then notice that the medulla is continuous with the spinal cord without any landmark, really showing that the medulla has stopped and the spinal cord has begun. The last portion of the brain that I want to talk about is right here. This is the cerebellum. It looks like a cauliflower. So it's cauliflower-ish in shape, and it is projecting from underneath the occipital lobe, which is here where I just created that star. So the cerebellum is important for the precise timing of skeletal muscle action, but it's also going to control our balance, which is what you see here in the picture as our woman is trying to put on her shoes without sitting down. It's also going to store movement patterns, so it's responsible for muscle memory, and this is important for sports players. I mean, when you're up to bat at the plate, you don't want to be thinking elbow up, eye on the ball. No, you should have practiced enough by then in order to have muscle memory so that you know how to swing without even thinking about it when the time comes. It can also send messages to initiate corrective measures in our movements. And so, maybe sometimes someone asks you to pick up a box or a bag, and in your mind you think that it's going to be completely heavy, and so your body kind of preps to pick up a heavy object. But then when you actually lift it, you realize how light it is. And your body, your cerebellum, is going to stimulate your muscles to correct your motion so that you don't fall over and tip over and hurt yourself. Instead, you're going to be able to compensate pretty quickly for the heaviness of that object so that you don't hurt yourself. And that is our cerebellum. I just want to make one more mention of what inputs the cerebellum receives. Fibers from our inner ear, our eyes, and the proprioceptors from our muscles and our tendons. All of these things are going to help to influence our body's position and our body's movements. So again, you can see that this complex function of movement really requires a large portion of our nervous system, receptors from all over, along with many different parts of the brain to ensure that our movements are smooth and appropriate. I also just wanted to make mention too that the cerebellum is not a part of the brainstem. There's only 3 parts to the brainstem, and the cerebellum is not one of them. That's all that I have. Thanks for watching these videos, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.